What happens when an empire's most valuable asset is also its most volatile, contested commodity? For the Mongol warrior, a human captive was his right, his reward, his personal property. But for the great Khan, that same captive was a state resource, a strategic asset to be allocated at will. This fundamental, unresolved conflict over the ownership of a human being would define the legal chaos of the Mongol world. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together of the Mongol Empire. The legal architecture of the Mongol conquests, the great Yasa attributed to Genghis Khan, was a code forged for one purpose: the efficient prosecution of total war. It was a military doctrine before it was a civic one, and its statutes concerning conquered peoples were pragmatic, uncompromising, and brutal. A people that surrendered upon summons became Haryat, or taxed subjects, but a people that resisted, that forced the Tumans to deploy the siege engines and spill Mongol blood, forfeited, by law, everything: their lives, their lands, their property, and their bodies. The legal term for this human spoil of war was boghole. We must analyze this term with cold precision. It does not translate to serf or servant. It translates to chattel. It denotes an object, an article of property, legally indistinguishable from a horse, a yurt, or a quiver of arrows. This is where the sands of ownership begin to shift. For the common Mongol soldier, the nukur, this system was the very basis of his livelihood. He fought not for a fixed salary, but for a guaranteed share of the plunder. When we consult the primary sources, like the secret history of the Mongols, we see that the division of spoils was a foundational, almost sacred right. It was the physical manifestation of the bond between a commander and his men. After a city was sacked, the surviving population was driven out and sorted. The Noyan, the generals, would oversee the division. A soldier received his portion of gold, his allotted silks, his horses, and his boghole. To that soldier, the captive woman led back to his yurt, or the strong man assigned to his herd, was his. This was not a privilege. It was his right, earned with his own blood and guaranteed by the traditions of the steppe, seemingly codified in the Yasa itself. He believed he had the right to sell this slave, to bequeath this slave to his son, or to kill this slave, subject only perhaps to the immediate will of his decimal commander. This was the ancient, unwritten law of the warrior. What a man takes in battle, he owns. But the Yasa was a tool of centralizing power, and it contained a profound and perhaps intentional contradiction. While it sanctified the warrior's right to his share, it enshrined an even higher absolute principle: the supreme authority of the great Khan. In Mongol political theory, the Khan was not merely a first among equals. He was the Khagan, the Khan of Khans, the earthly embodiment of the will of Tengri, the eternal blue sky. By this divine mandate, the Khagan was the ultimate owner of everything: the land, the rivers, the grass, and by extension, all the people within the empire, including the Mongols themselves. The Yasa made disobedience to the Khan a capital offense, and the spoils of a war waged in the Khan's name They, too, ultimately belong to the Khan. Here is the legal collision. What happens when these two foundational principles, the soldier's right to his plunder and the Khan's right to all property, meet on the battlefield? Imagine the scene. A Noyan has just distributed 5,000 captives to his victorious, exhausted army. His men are leading their new bog hall away. Then, a Darugachi, an imperial overseer, arrives from the great Khan's Ordu court with a decree. The decree states that all artisans, all engineers, and all unmarried young women from the captured city are now property of the great Khan, to be requisitioned for state workshops or for the imperial household. This is the flashpoint. The Darugachi, acting on the Khan's supreme authority, attempts to seize the soldier's bog hole. The soldier, standing on his own right to personal plunder, sees this not as a requisition, but as theft. He sees a violation of the military compact. His commander, the Noyan, is now trapped between his duty to his men and his fealty to his Khan. This legal ambiguity was not a flaw. It was a structural feature of the empire. It created a constant, churning tension between the centralized state and the decentralized, personal property traditions of the steppe. The soldier's ownership was perpetually conditional. The Khan's ownership was absolute in theory, but often unenforceable at the point of a sword hundreds of miles from the capital. This chaotic legal gray zone, where a human being's owner could change in an instant, set the stage for the next great conflict, the bitter, intractable feuds over inheritance. The legal storm, born from the contradiction between a soldier's plunder right and the Khan's supreme authority, did not wait for a Noyan's death to erupt. It was a constant, simmering crisis. But it was in death that this crisis found its most destructive and bitter expression: the inheritance feud. When a Mongol warrior or nobleman died, his property was subject to division, a process dictated by ancient steppe custom. His herds, his weapons, his armor, his yurts, and his bog hole. Here, the entire legal framework of the empire fractures. Let us first analyze the steppe custom. Mongol inheritance, while complex, traditionally favored the youngest son, the Atgan, who inherited the paternal hearth. Other sons would receive their share of the herds and property as they came of age and married. But how does one apply this custom to human property? A herd of sheep can be divided. How is a single, skilled artisan divided? Or a concubine who has borne her master children? This is where we must deconstruct the chain of title, for it was almost always broken. The status of the deceased's bog hole was hopelessly, dangerously ambiguous. Imagine a Noyan. A great general dies. He leaves behind an Ordu court staffed with hundreds of slaves. His two sons immediately begin to quarrel, and their quarrel is a legal minefield. The elder son claims, "I rode on campaign with our father. The bog hole we captured are our plunder, by right of conquest." The younger son, the Atgan, counters, "By the custom of our fathers, I inherit the Ordu. These slaves are part of the Ordu. They are mine." This feud, a personal battle over wealth, instantly escalates into a state crisis. A Darugachi, the Khan's regional overseer, arrives. He holds a list. He declares that 30 of the deceased slaves, the best weavers, the most skilled blacksmiths, the armorers, were not bog hole at all. They were hastan, state-owned artisans on loan from the great Khan's imperial workshops to his loyal general. They are not inheritable. They revert immediately to the Khan. The Noyan sons are outraged. They see this as a state-sanctioned theft of their patrimony. The Darugachi sees it as a simple reclamation of state property. The slaves themselves, the objects of this dispute, can only watch as their fates are debated by their masters. Their chain of ownership is not just broken, it is being claimed by three rival, armed factions. This chaos was not the exception, it was the rule. It was a structural flaw, born from the clash of two irreconcilable legal systems, one governing personal property, steppe custom, and one governing state assets, military law. Into this legal vacuum, a new and powerful force emerged, the market. The Mongol conquests had not just accumulated human captives, they had created vast new urban centers. Cities like Sarai, the capital of the Golden Horde, or Tabriz in the Ilkhanate, became sprawling cosmopolitan hubs. They were filled with a new urban elite, Mongol administrators, Persian bureaucrats, and Uyghur merchants, who had immense wealth but did not go on campaign. They had no access to plunder, but they had a massive demand for labor. They needed domestic servants, concubines, and workers for their new estates. Simultaneously, the common soldier, or minor Noyan, faced a problem. His bog hole were a high-maintenance asset. They had to be fed and guarded. They were a source of constant legal friction, liable to be requisitioned by the Khan or fought over by his heirs. A herd of horses could be left on the steppe, but a human captive was a risk. The solution was brutal and pragmatic: liquidation. The soldier, wary of his tenuous ownership, realized his captive was more valuable as cash. This confluence of high supply from the military and high demand from the cities created the great slave markets of the Mongol Empire. When we consult the records of travelers like Ibn Battuta, who journeyed through the Golden Horde in the 14th century, he describes these markets with the detached air of a man observing a common transaction. He speaks of buying slave girls for his retinue, as one might speak of buying grain. This normalization is terrifying because it reveals a profound legal shift. The slave market became a cynical laundromat for the broken chain of title. Let us analyze this new economic and legal function. A soldier brings his bog hole, whose legal status is ambiguous, to the market in Sarai. The slave trader, often a Khwarezmian or Genoese merchant operating under the Khan's protection, does not care about the yasa or steppe custom. He does not ask, was this captive a state asset or personal plunder? He asks one question: what is the price? The moment the transaction occurs, the bog hole's past is erased. The merchant, having paid in silver dirhams, now has a bill of sale. He has a new chain of title, one based not on conquest, but on commerce. When he sells this slave to a bureaucrat, that bureaucrat's ownership is clear, absolute, and defended by the civil administrators of the city. The market, in essence, created a parallel legal system. It bypassed the chaotic clash between military law and steppe custom, replacing it with the simple, cold logic of economics. A human being's owner was no longer the warrior who captured him or the Khan who claimed him, but the man who held the receipt. The great Khans and their regional successors did not just tolerate this, they encouraged and profited from it. The Jargu, the Mongol court system, was far more concerned with property disputes than human rights, and the khans themselves became the single largest sellers. When a campaign yielded a surplus of captives, tens of thousands of unskilled laborers for whom the state had no immediate use, they were not simply released. They were marched to these new urban markets and sold en masse. The silver they fetched went directly into the imperial treasury to pay the army and fund the state. The slave, the bog hole, was now trapped in a terrifying three-way legal battle. His body was a contested asset, fought over by the steppe custom of his master's sons, the supreme military law of the Khan, and the new, relentless economic force of the open market. This fragile, shifting state of ownership was about to be shattered completely by the arrival of a new, powerful ideology, one that would bring its own, entirely different set of laws to bear on the question: what and who is a slave? In the chaotic legal landscape of the empire, a battleground of steppe custom, military decree, and new market economics, one institution was meant to provide clarity. This was the Jargu, the Mongol court. Yet, when we investigate how these courts settled the ferocious disputes over human property, we find they were not guided by a quest for justice, but by a mandate for order and for the preservation of the Khan's power. The Jarguchi, the judge who presided over these cases, was a high-ranking state administrator. He was not a philosopher. When two of Anoyan's sons appeared before him, fighting over their father's slaves, his verdict was a cold, pragmatic calculation. First, he would consult the imperial register. Were any of the slaves in question Hastan, state-owned artisans? If so, the Jarguchi would rule them to be property of the Great Khan, to be immediately reclaimed by the state. This was not a legal argument, it was an audit. For the remaining bog hole, the chattel slaves, the judge would then turn to steppe custom. He would likely affirm the right of the Atgan, the youngest son, to the Ordu, household, and all the domestic slaves attached to it, while dividing the herders and field hands with the rest of the livestock. But if one son produced a bill of sale, showing he had purchased a slave from his father before his death, the Jargu would almost certainly uphold the transaction. Why? Because the market was a source of tax revenue for the Khan. The court's primary function was to protect the Khan's interests, which were, in order, his state property, his tax revenue, and the stability of his noble houses. In this entire proceeding, the object of the dispute, the bog hole, was silent. They were not a party to the case. They were the prize. Their own will, their family connections, their humanity, were as legally irrelevant to the Jarguchi as the opinion of a sheep in a dispute over grazing rights. The Jargu was not a court of justice. It was a court of asset arbitration. This brutal but stable legal framework, a hierarchy of Khan, custom, and cash, was about to be shattered by the most powerful ideological force of the medieval world, Islam. In the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the rulers of the Western Khanates, the Golden Horde on the Volga, and the Ilkhanate in Persia made a profound, state-altering decision. Burki Khan, Ghazan Khan, Ozbeg Khan. One by one, the descendants of Genghis Khan converted to Islam. This was not merely a personal conversion, it was a state policy. And with Islam, they adopted a legal code far more ancient, sophisticated, and detailed than the Yasa, the Shari'a. This set the two legal systems on a direct an irreconcilable collision course, and the bog hole was at the epicenter. We must analyze the fundamental conflict. The first clash was over the very source of slavery. According to the Yasa, any person who resisted the Khan, regardless of faith, could be enslaved. A Muslim who fought the Mongols became a bog hole. But according to Shari'a, it was haram, forbidden, to enslave a free Muslim. One could only enslave a kafir, or non-believer, captured in a holy war. This created an immediate paradox for a ruler like Ghazan Khan, the Ilkhan of Persia. When he, as a Muslim sultan, attacked the Mamluks of Egypt, who were also Muslims, what was the status of his captives? By the Yasa, the military code that gave him his army, they were bog hole. By Shari'a, the religious code that gave him his legitimacy as a sultan, they were free Muslims, hur, who could not be enslaved. The second and more profound conflict was over inheritance and status. Under the Yasa and steppe custom, the child of a bog hole, a female slave, was a bog hole. Status was inherited from the mother. This created the permanent, self-perpetuating slave class that the Mongol economy required. But under Shari'a, the legal doctrine of walad, mother of a child, dictated that a slave concubine who bore her master's child was automatically freed upon his death. More critically, her child, the master's child, was born legally free and was a legitimate heir. This single doctrine was a legal bomb dropped into the foundations of the Mongol social structure. Imagine the Jargu now. A Noyan, now a Muslim emir, dies. His son by his Mongol Khatun, senior wife, appears, claiming all property under the Yasa. But a second claimant appears, the young son of the emir's favorite Persian concubine. By the Yasa, both that concubine and her child are bog hole, inheritable property. But by Shari'a, the concubine is now an walad, and her son is hur, free, and a legal heir with a right to a full share of the inheritance. The Jarguchi, now forced to be a qadi, Islamic judge, as well, was trapped. To rule for the Yasa was to deny his Khan's new state religion. To rule for the Shari'a was to dismantle the very system of property and military custom that his Noyan aristocracy was built on. In the end, neither system won outright. The Yasa remained the code of the military, the steppe, and the Mongol deep state. But Shari'a became the undeniable law of the cities, of commerce, and, crucially, of family and inheritance. Over generations, it provided the one thing the Yasa never had, a path to freedom. The Shari'a doctrines of ITQ, manumission as a pious act, and the walad provided a slow but powerful engine of assimilation. The chains of the Yasa, forged to be permanent and hereditary, were rendered breakable by the new faith. For the captive woman, her child could now be born free. For the male slave, he could be freed as an act of his master's piety. The sands of ownership, once shifting between the warrior, the Khan, and the market, now had a new, powerful current, and it flowed, however slowly, toward liberation. The great legal systems of empire, the Yasa and Shari'a, argued not over the morality of slavery, but over its management and its rules of transfer. They were rival blueprints for the ownership of a human soul. In the end, the sands of ownership never truly settled. They simply shifted, as they always do, leaving the captive, the bog hole, to navigate a world where his only value was his price, and his only hope lay in the contradictions of his masters.